Hi everyone, I'm going to show you today a film of how I go about using palette knives to make acrylic paintings. And apologies for any toddler crying you can hear in the background. So palette knives. Here you see my favourite type of palette knife. These are rectangular, square-ended, flat-ended. They're not the traditional type of palette knife. Here are some more. Nice big selection. So I do find that most often palette knives which are sold in art shops are what I call pointy ended or triangular ended, and I just don't find that they work well for me. I love these square ended ones, which you can also get in much larger size or much smaller size, but pretty much the only palette knife I use, and I use often, is this type. Why do I like them? Well, I like that you can paint with them, apply paint with them, you can mix paint with them, either on your palette or on your painting. Once you've got that paint applied thickly using a palette knife, it then brings you all sorts of options of drawing into the paint. And whatever colour is underneath your thick, wet acrylic paint will come through when you draw. Using any tool you want, really. You can use the wrong end of a paintbrush, you can use a pencil as I just did, or this plastic scraper tool. While this is still wet, I can think, oh no, that's not what I wanted, and I can go right back over it and obscure the whole thing. Can push the palette knife onto its side and scratch away, and look, here's an effect which I hadn't intended at all. The lines which I drew in have shown up when I scrape off the thick acrylic. So just experiment and experiment. Palette knives I also use for taking paint out of my paint pots. All the excess paint that I have on my palette knives and on my brushes, before I put brushes or palette knives into water, that's the sound of my water jar, I rub off all the paint that I can onto a cloth, an old t-shirt or old socks or paper napkins from cafes, anything like that. And the reason for doing that is to make sure that as little as possible acrylic paint is going down the sink when you empty out your paint water. So, lid off, and I use my palette knives to take the paint out of my paint pots and put it onto my palette. I didn't want to put this colour here, but there we go. This is yellow ochre, one of my favourite colours. You can use palette knives to create quite delicate little marks, quite big, thick, very big, thick, splodgy marks. With acrylic paint, I can leave the paint as thickly as this and it will eventually dry. You can scrape away into that. Just a really good tool to expand your painting if you're using acrylics. I shall show you some of the triangular ended ones as well. So just you get very different marks, and of course these can be useful. You should try them out if you like the look of palette knives. This is quite a long bladed one. If you push your palette knife down and then pull it back up like this, you get these interesting textures. going to clean that knife again. And now I'm going to bring in a completely different colour and a lovely bold blue, cobalt blue. So now, if I just gently touch this on top, the wet blue will not mix much with the wet yellow ochre underneath. If I press this down much more, you'll start to get more mixing going on. Now I'm going to try using my favourite shape to scrape away. That's interesting. Some of the yellow ochre shows up on the edges of my scraping. Or I can take it all away, or let's try putting it back. Oh, look how it's getting completely different. Sort of very mucky as the colours mix together. Now let's try drawing into it again. Or you could even write into it. Leo. This sort of thing could be good for adding texture into perhaps the grassy foreground of a painting, or foliage onto trees. Or a rocky shore. Or just little highlights on the edge of a building. Perhaps moonlight catching on the gable of a house. So lots of those scribbles are still showing through underneath. Right, so get yourself a palette knife and just experiment with it and see what you think. You can get these quite cheap, very cheap sets where you get normally 5 different plastic palette knives. They're fine, but I personally much prefer the wooden handled, metal bladed ones. And I'm trying to remember always to wipe the paint off onto cloths rather than putting it into water and therefore into the water system. Okay, so now I'm going to make a painting based on the view out of my studio window right now, looking up at the bin in Burnt Island. That's B-I-N-N, it's the hill that rises up above Burnt Island. And it's looking extremely nice just now at nearly 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. Nicely sunlit from the left, a sort of golden glowing sun. I'll just put this aside. Okay, so very often I make my paintings, almost always I make my paintings, acrylic or oil paintings, on a coloured background. I have lots of different sheets of lots of different sheets of card or old mountboard, which I put background colours on. Sometimes what I do is I'm just using up leftover paint on my palette at the end of the painting session. And I've got a drawer full of these, so when I'm looking to do a painting I can look through these and see which colour seems to fit best the painting that I'm thinking of making. And if you experiment with this, you'll find that a painting, the same painting done on a yellow background like this, or a blue background like this, will be a very different finished painting. I'm only going to use these square-ended palette knives, and we'll see how much of this painting is done in palette knife, but I have completed paintings where the whole thing has been made in palette knife. So, as I said, the thing I'm going to paint is the view out my studio window. And I'm in the final weeks of being in this studio, which is in our house in Burnt Island. Soon our son will be getting his own bedroom, and I will be getting my own new studio down at Burnt Island railway station. I'll update people more on that soon. So you can't see all of my palette, unfortunately, but the colours that I'll have on it are, I'll always have white, I'll always have a dark brown, this time raw umber, at the moment raw umber, ultramarine blue, and I use my dark brown and my dark blue to mix together to make my blacks, or my darkest colours. I'll just show you this. Before I clean this palette knife to put it into the brown paint, what I quite often do at this early stage is I brush my palette knife over parts of the painting, getting the excess paint off and adding an underlying texture to the painting. And this texture will show through in parts of the finished painting. Well, it may show through. Sometimes it will show through quite strongly, and sometimes it will almost all be obscured. Here's my dark brown, ultramarine. I haven't drawn in any outlines of the hill which I'm painting, so you'll just hopefully enjoy seeing it gradually appearing as I paint. And there will be the rooftops of the houses opposite, probably. So I was cleaning off this raw umber, cleaning it off my palette knife, but turns out I've just started painting with it. So here's the painting underway, and I've only put on the brown and the white so far, but already those two, combined with the yellow ochre background, are starting to build up quite an interesting surface. I need to stand up every so often to check that this is still recording. And I also apologise if my hair is appearing, the top of my head is appearing in the shot ever. Now here is the building opposite me. With slate tiles, with slates for the rooftop. Some people really dislike palette knives and really dislike paintings made using palette knife because they can have a pretty unsubtle look. They can look quite sort of harsh, but I don't at all feel that's valid, and certainly not something I'm concerned with. I just find a palette knife is an extra really interesting tool to add into my painting technique. And it's an interesting challenge sometimes to try making a painting when using primarily a palette knife. When I am making a painting using palette knife, mostly palette knife, or solely palette knife, I will normally be doing it on a pretty small scale, actually even smaller than this, and you can see this isn't very large, unless I have giant hands. So I'm just thinking here about the rooftop opposite me. I wonder if the sound of the gulls outside is picking up in this recording. We have loads of lesser blackback gulls and some herring gulls which nest on the rooftops around here, which I love. Far quieter now than they are during the breeding season. And I've been noticing that robins have been really starting singing the past few weeks, now that autumn is upon us. Here are some dormer windows opposite me. See there how just the corner of the palette knife is working quite well for drawing into the still wet paint. A Felix window and various chimneys and vents. The light's really changed just since I started painting this. Something that happens an awful lot when painting from life. You know, I've managed to do so little of my own art during lockdown, and well, for many months now, and today, pretty good day, because I have been out all morning with our son and managed half an hour of sketching cormorants and a heron while he ate 2 apples and lots of oatcakes down in the shore here in Burnt Island, and then came home and spent the past hour and a half working on a commission which I haven't managed to work on for many weeks, and now I'm getting to do this palette knife painting for you all. So hopefully this is a sign of good things to come. See how, just like with brushes, you can get far more than just one type of mark using your palette knife. And that will make a painting much more interesting. That does make a painting much more interesting, having a good variety of different types of marks within it. That's a complaint about paintings which are done solely using palette knife. They definitely can often look very much made using just one type of mark, and I suppose that's why most often I just use palette knife as part of my painting equipment rather than as the sole thing for making a painting. But for this particular piece, I'm seeing how far I can get using only palette knife. I can hear a robin out there now. really going to have to get on with this sky, which is getting darker by the minute. So when I started, it was, as I said, very different from now. So, right, here's what we've got now. The clouds are rather delicate looking out there, and that is something which palette knife isn't so good at. So, may well not be too true to life. Quite a lot of blue showing up there just now. Right. This is cobalt blue. Can you see that mixing? Yeah. Cobalt blue being mixed with the titanium white. Now, can you see that as I'm doing this, you can see that my palette has got a rather textured surface? Well, what I'm using for my palette is a piece of corrugated cardboard. That's not true. Corrugated plastic. I've been using this very piece of corrugated plastic ever since first year art college, so that is, well, rather a long time. Not too far off 20 years since I started art college. And I don't clean the palette after use. I let the acrylic paint just dry on it, and I do this, well, to save time, and because it will massively reduce the amount of plastic which I would otherwise be putting down the sink if I were to clean this palette in the sink after every single use. So I just let the acrylic paint build up and up on my palette, and then eventually, probably every 2, 3, 4 years, I get one corner of the palette and start to peel off, as you can see there, start to peel off the acrylic paint. And the thicker the paint is, the more easily it peels off, and sometimes the whole palette peels off and you get the most beautiful colours underneath. But anyway, where I'm going with this is, if I was using a flatter surface, a completely flat surface, then I'd be managing to pick up all that paint onto my palette knife a bit more easily than I am now. This is ultramarine blue, which is not the one I'm wanting right now. I'll put a bit out while I'm at it. Okay. Let's just put a little bit of ultramarine blue into the craggy hillside. Okay, now more white. And more cobalt blue. Although I probably won't need much more of it. What I was saying about using a coloured piece of card or board. If you see here all this yellow undercoat coming through, imagine this same painting so far done on a blue undercoated piece of board. Imagine all this yellow which shines through would not be yellow but would be blue, and the painting would look completely different. It would be a much colder painting. Well, as I'm painting a sky with a sunset in it, although the sunset is way off this way, this colour of background seems much more appropriate to what I wanted this evening. apologies for any nonsense that I talk during this. It's remarkably hard to paint and talk, as I always find during demonstrations which I have given over the years to lots of different art clubs. I've mixed a little bit of yellow ochre in here now to try to bring a touch of warmth into the sunsetty sky, and I'm putting this on top over here. Yeah, remarkably difficult to talk and paint, yet one feels compelled to talk whilst giving painting demos. Probably to distract people from the possibly not quite as one intended them results. Now that colour which I've just mixed there, which is still the cobalt blue, titanium white, and now some yellow ochre, I'm now bringing touches of that down onto the rooftops to help tie the whole painting together. The robin is still singing outside. I'm starting to really enjoy this, which probably means I'm going to forget to talk as much, which, as discussed a few moments ago, may not be a bad thing. So I've tried to have darker, richer blue over towards the right, away from the setting sun, and warmer over towards the left, towards the setting sun. And you've got here the impression of the rooftops, but it's very sketchy. Well, it may be that that is pretty much how I leave it. Not quite decided yet, but I want to work on this hillside because honestly most of the colour has gone out of the hillside in real life now. So greens in acrylic. A lot of greens can look pretty chemically, I find, with acrylic paints, and very often what I do when I'm painting with them, this one is called green gold, very often what I do when painting with acrylic greens is to add little touches of a brown or perhaps a red into them. Just makes them more subtle. I've added quite a lot in here. What I see looking out the window is, looking at the hillside, is rock face, which right now is browns and reds, dark browns and very, very slight red tinges to the dark browns, and nice mossy green where there are bits of grass up towards the top of the hill, and assorted different greens where there are trees on the hillside, especially over here on the left. There's also one nice tree in the foreground which peeks up above these. Oh dear, I just used my finger. Look, I'm going over that with a palette knife so that I can still hopefully claim that the whole painting was made using palette knife. Yeah, there's a nice tree coming up here, but I might put it off to the side a bit. We'll see. I won't decide that quite yet. I think I managed at the start of this film not to say I'm going to do a quick demonstration. I think this is the first one, maybe the first one, where I haven't said I'm going to do a quick demonstration. Because every time I do say it, it's a lie. Yet it seems to just slip out of my mouth. Let's try some of that green without the brown mixed in. More green required. Clean off my palette knife before putting it back in. And I always put the lids back on these jars, these pots, straight away, because acrylic does dry quickly. Some of these colours, ones which I don't use particularly much, I have had these very tubs which are still working well. I've had since the year I left art college, so about 13 years, 14 years, and they still haven't dried out. There's a particularly light bit of grass just here, so I'm going to mix some white into this. And a touch of the ochre. And my palette is slightly in the way and not allowing me. That's better. Yeah, I think that's really nice to have this bit of light coming in there. You might find when an acrylic painting done really thickly like this dries, you might find that it looks a touch darker than you had thought it was. And paint does generally dry a little darker than it looks when it's wet, and loses some of its wet sheen. You can do things like varnishing a painting to help counter some of that, if you wish. See how the lighter colours really nicely pick up on top of the darker colours. And this is something you can really exploit to represent tree tops, for example, or boulders on a beach. I can do another painting demo video another day where I show that, doing a rocky shore using this technique, starting off with really dark palette knife boulders, then adding in a touch of white, making the boulders a shade lighter, then another touch of white, making highlights of a shade lighter still. Oh, it's so much darker out there now. Okay, so now I think the rooftop wants a little bit more warmth to come into it, little hints. Because, yeah, there's too much separation between the sky, the hill, and the rooftops right now, so I'll see if I can manage to make myself a bit happier with that. I think you may have got my hair in shot just then. I don't tend to watch these films back because it's rather painful listening to oneself. And now, you might really think, you might feel that you really like a painting like this where it is, well, pretty hard to read. Pretty busy. You might like that. You might really dislike that. You can do things to remedy that. You can paint in a few detailed areas, even just paint in a few lines. You can use a pencil to draw in some detail, as I showed earlier. So I could, for example, draw along the rooftops, outline some of this, and I probably will do some of that shortly. You could let this completely dry and then paint in quite a lot of detail on top. Something that I need to do, darken up some parts of the rooftop. So, mixing up an ultramarine blue and my raw umber. Good, this does appear to still be videoing. 38 minutes, that's terrible. Yeah, this is exactly what I was wanting, just a little bit of dark down here, some outlining, and I'm deciding that, yeah, I'm not going to use anything but this palette knife. I won't do any pencil drawing on this one. See, what I'm doing now, which is effectively drawing straight but admittedly quite imperfect lines using the square end of my palette knife, I find that I really can't do that very well at all using the more commonly used triangular ended or round ended palette knives. The windows are mostly reflecting dark just now, and it's not dark enough for any of them to have any warm bright lights shining out of the houses. Not yet. Don't want that bit to be there. So, get my rag back out. That's good. Managed to mostly remove that. There, that's better. Okay. going to leave this fairly soon. Chimneys. Don't know if you can hear the jackdaws coming in to roost on some of the chimney pots. Making their chat chat. That's the only bird impression you're getting. Right, definitely getting there. I'm very, very happy for people who watch these to send me any questions. So do that if you'd like to get in touch. There's an aerial, rather tall aerial, sticking out beside this chimney. Smaller one here. And that's an extremely thick piece of paint. I don't want that just there. That's fine. And quite a few jackdaws, yeah, are flying in now. So let's just have the suggestion of jackdaws. Too thick again. Lift that off. The suggestion of jackdaws, or whichever. Oh, whole group just went right over. Jackdaws, or whichever corvid you prefer. Up here in the sky. This is reminding me of an oil painting I did of a pair of ravens flying over Inchcailloch Island on Loch Lomond on a trip Jennifer and I went on just a couple of days after our wedding. Okay, I am going to leave it at this. Almost at this. That's better. I can hear Oren chatting. Bedtime approaches. I shall be using a brush for one little bit of this for when I sign it. Nice fine brush. This is actually a pretty good representation of my knot. Very neat. Handwriting. Alright, there we go. Oh, even with brushes, brush that excess paint off before putting the brush in your water. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed watching this, and I hope you enjoy trying out palette knives for yourselves. And as you can see here, I have quite a lot of paint left on my palette. I am going to leave that there right now because I'm going to continue painting with it on the commission I'm working on. But if you were finishing your painting session now and you had all that left, do not pour that down the sink. If there's no way you can use this paint, wipe it off with a rag or with an old tissue, something like that, and let it dry and then put it in the landfill. Or ideally you will use this to create backgrounds like I showed you earlier. These are done on on excess pieces of mount board or on card or whatever you want, really, old cardboard, cereal packets. Or what you can do is you can spray or drip clean water onto all these different blobs of paint. Cover your palette with a sheet of plastic, making sure that you've got jars or something on here to stop the plastic touching the wet paint. Seal it all up at the edges as much as you can by putting heavy jars or paintbrushes on. And I find in my nice cold studio I can leave that overnight and work with that paint again the next day. Or if you are wanting to if you're wanting to use the paint again a couple of days later, then what you should do is do exactly as I described, and then the next day lift off the plastic, drip more water on, cover it all up again, and sometimes my paints will last 2 or 3 days like that. Alright, thank you for watching.